This is the Owens Corning insulation module for floors, basements, and crawl spaces. This program will guide you through everything you need to know for professional installation of Owens Corning products in these special applications. We will cover installations between floors, options in basement insulation, installing bats in 2x4 cavities, and installing Owens Corning's basement blanket, and how to insulate crawl spaces. Insulation is often installed between the floors of a house to make it quieter and more livable. You will generally use unfaced insulation between these floors because we don't need a vapor retarder between levels. Install the insulation by simply pushing it up into the joist cavity until it fits against the subfloor above. The friction fit of the insulation will keep it in place for the time being. Install the insulation all of the way to the end of each joist run so that it touches the band joist. There will usually be a narrow joist cavity by the walls that run parallel to the joists. You will need to cut your insulation to fit this space. Cut it about 1 inch wider than the cavity so it will stay in place nicely and provide the best performance. There are often pipes and wires in floors and occasionally even junction boxes. Run the insulation above the pipes. If the wiring is near the floor, simply cover it with insulation. If the wiring is close to the bottom of the joist, run the insulation above it as you did the pipes. If the wiring is in the middle of the joist, split the insulation and fit it around the wiring and snugly against the floor. Insulate right over any junction boxes that you find in the floor. Insulate around cross braces by cutting the insulation and pushing it between the cross braces like this. To secure the insulation, use nylon banding or strapping. Staple the strapping to the floor joist just under the insulation and space your attachments every 2 to 3 feet. You can also use wire supports, commonly called tiger teeth, to hold the insulation in place. If you use craft-faced insulation for this application, be certain the facing is pushed tightly against the subfloor above. If the band joists require a vapor retarder and will be left exposed, then you will need to use Flame Spread 25. This is a product that provides the necessary vapor retarder and is also safe to use with a facing exposed. You will need short pieces at the end of each joist run and a long piece at the top of the sidewall. Now let's go downstairs. There are a number of different methods for insulating basements and crawl spaces. Let's start with a basement. First, will the basement be finished or unfinished? A finished basement will be insulated the same way you did the exterior walls upstairs, with either faced bats or unfaced insulation with a poly vapor retarder. If the basement is to be left unfinished, we recommend Owens Corning's basement blanket insulation, featuring an attractive fire-resistant white facing that is okay to leave exposed. Basement blanket comes in 4-foot wide rolls with flanges on both sides. In some areas, you may only be required to insulate the top half of the basement wall. In this case, you will install the rolls horizontally. Simply staple the basement blanket flange to the top plate, being careful as you move down the wall not to tear the flange. You may need to nail a furring strip to the top plate if it is recessed to make hanging the basement blanket easier. You will also nail a furring strip to the wall 4 feet below the top plate and again staple the flange to hold the blanket securely in place. This is a very quick and simple installation. For a full wall application, you would simply nail another furring strip about 2 inches above the floor. This will protect the insulation from any minor water damage should the basement experience any water leakage. You will then staple in place a second roll of basement blanket. And again, don't forget to insulate the basement's band joists. Now let's look at insulating crawl spaces. First, check to see if the crawl space you're insulating is vented or unvented. This is important because there is a different approach to insulating each type. For vented crawl spaces, you will need to insulate the floor space overhead. This approach is very similar to what you just learned about insulating floors. You will install the bats with a facing up, pointing toward the warm and winter space above. The bats are installed the full length of each joist run for complete coverage under the house. And you will probably need to use the same technique you just learned to insulate around pipes, wiring, cross braces, and maybe even dryer vents. After all of your bats are in place, secure them with tiger teeth or nylon banding. In an unvented crawl space, you'll insulate the walls rather than the ceiling. You can use either an unfaced blanket or Owens Corning's basement blanket. The basement blanket is installed the same way as you learned earlier. Simply staple the flange into the top plate, allowing the blanket to drape down the wall. It's just that simple. If your builder requires the use of unfaced insulation, the installation is very much the same. In this case, you will attach the unfaced blanket to the top plate using cap nails. Simply drive a cap nail through the blanket and into the top plate every 16 to 24 inches. For all of these different methods, be certain to cover the floor of the crawl space if it's unfinished. Using a 4 or 6 mil poly, roll it up the wall a few inches, behind the insulation, and then spread it out evenly. Overlap sections of poly by a couple of feet. You will also want to insulate all the joist cavities as you learned earlier. For this job and all your jobs, carefully inspect all the insulation for anything you may have missed. This last-minute inspection and cleaning up thoroughly at the end of each job makes for a professional look. By using the practices and techniques that we have outlined in this module, you will assure that the homeowner receives the top quality insulation value they paid for, and you and your company will be recognized as true insulation professionals.